So in 2014, I actually did talk about this project, and we were talking about it because it was just funded by Movember Canada, and we were pitching what we were going to do and talking about some of the complexities of working between federal corrections, the School of Nursing, and a community partner. So it was more just a look at what we're up to. So here we are, more than 2 years later, almost at the end of this project, with lots of plans in place. We can now actually say that what we have from Movember was really seed funding pilot work because it's kind of taken off in the last couple of years. So we have done quite a lot of public presentations about the impact on the offenders. And so that's taken a significant focus in the study because Movember was very interested in the incarcerated men and impacts on their mental health. So we were funded that way. But the project actually was also focused on the communities involved. And so we've just in the last 6 months really put our efforts into understanding the community side of this project, which is what we're going to talk to you about today. So lots more to come around the men. We have a paper in press right now about the men, the offenders, and the correctional side of the project. But basically it's been a community and corrections project in one. And so we've tried to really move back and forth and place equal emphasis. But it really has, to this point, shifted towards the men. So Kelsey and I are going to tag team this. So we will move seamlessly back and forth.
Well, I was going to say, right before you switch that major slide, let me get a tweet out. Thank you. You're good.
Sweet. Wow. Okay. So just before we start, Colleen, are you in the room on the phone?
I saw Allison, Sally.
Yeah, Colleen's on.
Is there a way to
Okay.
do this without? Okay.
Oh, she's there.
I'm here.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Okay, so just to begin, acknowledgements, Movember has funded a 2-year study that we're coming to the end of. We have a research team that Colleen is a very central member to, and so just acknowledging her on the phone and speaking from the box, I guess, here. We have a team that crosses federal corrections, UBC School of Nursing, and a community partner, which is an executive director of an organization called Punky Lake Wilderness Camp Society. It's a nonprofit organization that does restorative justice programming for youth out of Williams Lake and serves the surrounding Chilcotin communities. So that is our key community partner. We have 2 wardens on the project who are wardens in the Pacific region, and they, while not at all of our meetings, are interpretive partners in terms of doing research in corrections, understanding what we're learning in the context of corrections, and so they're very significant. And just to say, you know, I always say the privilege of this work is like suddenly you're in places you never imagined you'd be, and meeting wardens and entering this world has been quite fascinating. And the parallels with healthcare, albeit another presentation, are quite significant in terms of institutionalized care and struggle and some of the challenges. And Kelsey, and just acknowledging that Phoebe Long was a research manager with us for a year, so she was a big part of the work to this point. So the work to give concept, just very briefly before we get to the focus, was really built on this idea in 2012 that men in prison, Indigenous men, but not solely Indigenous men, have idle time. And the idle time is connected with a negative institutional subculture. The more time on their hands, the more apt for them to be engaged in the kind of activities that don't promote rehabilitation and mental wellness, can exacerbate existing mental health challenges, can just feed this sort of negative cycle. That reduces in challenges to rehabilitation, and then even are connected with reoffense post-release. And so this idea of giving men meaningful work was really pivotal for kicking off the project. Lots of research about mundane work in prisons, sanitary, cleaning the bathrooms, we've all seen it in the movies, doing garden work, but this idea of engaging men in meaningful time spent. And so the idea was that meaningful employment and a way of passing a time in a meaningful way, because some men work, some men don't, depending on their context. Using a way to, in the quote of the retired warden who was the originator of the concept, help guys come out better than they went in, and reduce the need for drugs. So this was shocking to me, but we spend billions of dollars trying to create drugs from going into prisons, drone technology, all the stuff I've been learning about, but we don't really understand the need for drugs in prison. And so that was very, so he wrote a concept paper back in 2012, and this pilot initiative began in the federal prisons in the Fraser Valley. So all federal inmates across maximum to minimum security. So the idea was that the men would engage in meaningful work, but that it would be a meaningful work to give. So that's where the idea came from. And the reason the Chilcotin territory was selected as the recipients of the items the men were making is that it was, in 2012, considered one of the highest need areas in Aboriginal context in BC. And it continues to have the highest crime severity index in Williams Lake. Prolific offenders, many of them are from that area. There's high need, there's a high gang. I think somebody told me the other day it's the highest, I think it was our partners that we met with, highest car theft or something, which isn't, I don't think those are the guys in the federal system, but crime and gang life. So high need, men that need to do something meaningful. So that's where the idea came from. And so the idea is the men make, there's a distribution partner, and the Chilcotin communities receive. And so the goal is to give men this positive experience that is either paid employment or a way of passing time, and that communities would benefit. And so born of a fairly innovative model is this idea of a prison community partnership. And one of the wardens on our project finished his master's thesis when I first met him, and his whole thesis, his quote of his published paper is, "The prison shouldn't be an island. We have men locked up in prisons and we have communities in need. We need to start doing better prison community work." And now there are many models around the Lower Mainland of communities doing outreach work into prisons, or not so much into prisons, but men getting involved in communities. So this is part of that initiative. And then this third goal is a bit harder for us to tackle, but the wardens really asked us to say, how can work to give actually shift institutional culture and reduce this sort of negative patterns that create challenges to rehabilitation. Okay, so we have our research partnership, Personal Services of Canada, the Chilcotin National Government and Communities, and the School of Nursing. In 2014, we actually signed an MOU with the UBC School of Nursing. So this was a really significant moment for any of you that do community-based research and navigate ethics protocols and relationships that take years to develop. We were in the Chilcotin National Government working with the 6 chiefs for about 6 months, and we decided to write an MOU. And within the year of working with the TNG, Chilcotin National Government, we had an MOU with the School of Nursing. So as you all know, that to get that within a year is so important to any work you do. And so it creates an accountability and understanding, and that is still in place. So that is sort of, I guess for me, really personally important that we have a really explicit commitment to an understanding about what's good research. With Chilcotin National Government, a very powerful group in the province in terms of navigating that first Supreme Court land title case back in 2011. So, you know, the folks we're working with are really, really committed to self-governance and good research and a set of accountabilities that are pretty important. Okay, so I'm going to switch it on over to Kelsey here.
Hi everyone.
I'll say to the back.
So this is a map of the 6 Chilcotin communities. There's roughly 3,000 registered members that live in and around Williams Lake, and they've been there for thousands and thousands of years. The communities range from having, I think the smallest is about 25 people, and then some of them have about 650 living on the reserve. So they're quite rural and remote. None of them have grocery stores, so all of them have to go into Williams Lake to get all of their kind of basic needs met. So the barriers that exist that are trying to be met by Work to Give don't come from nowhere. They're based in ongoing historic legacies of colonialism. There's been, they were semi-nomadic prior to colonization, but then were displaced from their land, moved into smaller and smaller reserve settlements. This has created barriers to education, to employment. As Helen mentioned, there's really high crime rates. But within all this, there's also a lot of community strength and resurgence, and something that we're hoping to look more at as we continue on with this work. So Work to Give set out to see what the impacts of the program are on the men in the prison, on the communities, and then any possible connections between those two. So it's a mixed methods design. We've done qualitative interviews with incarcerated men who are participating in the project, community members who either receive some of the items or help in distribution or both, and then program stakeholders from the Correctional Service of Canada, from Punky Lake, the distribution partner, and other organizations that take part. We also spent a bunch of time in the communities talking to people, having tea, helping distribute items. This is an image of one of the beds going out to one of the communities, and have taken lots of field notes, photos. We're also working with Movember to have a 20-minute documentary that'll highlight more of this work. So as you'll see later, we have some pretty long quotes. The men and the community members have so much to say, and they're so eloquent in saying it. So we're really hoping that a documentary can capture that and share the impacts even more widely. There's also a quantitative portion. The offender management system, which is within the Correctional Service of Canada, has helped us to pinpoint some key variables that Elizabeth has done some great work on, and just looking at how we can look at work to give quantitatively, which is really important within the prison system because they are definitely numbers people. So we've done work with 3 of the prisons in the Pacific region: Mountain, which is a medium institution, medium security; Pacific, which is mixed level and also includes a treatment center for people with health needs; and then Mission Institution, which is a minimum security institution. As you can see, the men make a variety of items: furniture, toys, woven items like blankets and hats and socks, cultural things such as drums and rattles, and then organic vegetables are grown at the Mission Institution. That's not directly part of Work to Give, but something that I've looked at in my thesis research and we'll talk a little bit more about later on. We've interviewed a number of men at each of the institutions, and then 29 community members across 4 of the 6 Strickholton communities, and then program stakeholders. Right, back to you, Helen.
So just really briefly, we couldn't talk about the communities without talking about the men. So the men talk about the effects of being a part of Work to Give. And one of the most significant things, and there's a kind of busy slide coming, is that Work to Give creates a space within the prison context unlike any other. So it's a place where they feel they can escape, where they actually, quote, feel free. So the irony of feeling free inside the walls of an institution is pretty significant given the limited personal freedoms. They talk about it as a healing space, as a place of learning to work with others. And so our data is rich and diverse in terms of the impacts in there. As much on the level is just an embodied kind of sense of calmness. We have the guys say, when I walk through the doors, it feels calm. When I use my hand, I see my potential. And so it's everything from a very embodied sense of being in the space to working with other men to feeling supported by staff. And you can imagine the more we go and talk about the amazing work they do, they say to us, like, can you get that on YouTube so my mom and dad can see that, so my kids can see that. So it's pretty amazing. And it's been really important for us to get this out because it is a process of destigmatizing these guys inside because, as they say, like, we're not animals. You know, we're not animals, we're human beings, and we would like the world to see that and be also accountable for our crimes, which is a whole other kind of presentation, but just to be in interviews with people that have committed serious crimes and engage with them in a way where we're not interviewing them about their crime. So we don't start with, what'd you do? Right? So we don't start with the crime identity and the crime story, but we hear about the crime story as it relates to finding a way to improve themselves and eventually, hopefully, leave the institutions. So we hear, this are just really little bits of snippets, and I just want to say, like, the words on the screen are nothing when we actually get their voices. In the documentary, I think it's a little more powerful, but, you know, we're giving back. You know, for the first time in our life, we're actually giving back. One guy said to me, I've always been a taker. Now I'm actually somebody to give. We're putting a smile on people's faces. This is pretty powerful because it means something to the psychological services inside the prison. It's good therapy for ourselves. It's better than a shrink. Look at what we're doing with our hands. Look at what we're doing with our minds. It makes our light inside of us a little bit brighter. Many of them talk about it as a healing process. A large percentage of the men are Indigenous and talk about disconnection from family and land and community as part of where their lives have come. So it has significant impact on Indigenous men, but it wasn't created only for Indigenous men. So this is a busy slide, but this is how we're trying to capture all the impacts on the men. And just very, very briefly, all the impacts represent these intersecting contexts. So who the men are, their family lives, their social histories. The men who are making beds for kids, it's particularly meaningful if they didn't have a bed. So this idea of putting kids in beds is significant in the context of a personal history of sleeping on the floor or sharing a bed. We're not having your own space in often a social history of poverty and socioeconomic challenges. The prison context, as I've said, creates the meaning for work to give, right? So if they're making things in communities where they can come and go and have a lot of personal freedom, it's quite different than doing it inside the walls of a place where they describe themselves as a CS, Correctional Services of Canada, robot, right? Just moving through the institution as a robot. So the work to give space then creates something quite unique. The men have used the words restorative justice, so this idea of victor-offender mediation, although not direct, but knowing they're helping people that might in some way be connected to people they've harmed. So that's significant. So this is all the intersecting impacts. This is really significant. And then talk about, I see myself in a new way. I see I've got potential. From even just the skill of being somebody who can, quote, make park benches now for all of the BC parks as they make park. I can actually see myself as having something to do post-release. So, impacts on the men. Kelsey's going to talk a little bit about the garden and the impacts on the men, and then we're going to focus the remaining time on the communities.
I had the great pleasure of spending about 80 hours over the summer and fall gardening with the guys in the prison and just talking to them about the experience. And I set out to find out to what extent and what ways the Garden Project affects the experiences of meaningful work for the men working there, the food security and food sovereignty of the Chilcotin community that receives a portion of the food. They also donate to local food banks and soup kitchens, but that's not the focus within Work to Give. And then the meaningful connections that might exist between the community and the men who grow a portion of their food. So just very, very briefly, the layers on the men the impacts on the men were layered. First and foremost, they had access to food, and this was understood within often histories of going to bed hungry as a child. They also saw the garden as a means to metaphorically escape the institution. You could hear birds, you're listening to wind in the trees, you'll see the odd wildlife. There was a bear that hung out there when I was there, a very friendly bear. And this is contrasted to other experiences of work in institutions where there's fluorescent lights, it's noise, you're surrounded by other people that you might really want to avoid. So it provided that ability to escape and to feel free. They also had the pride of seeing everything they were growing and then giving that. The men actually got to take the boxes to some of the local organizations and see who they were donating to. Another man said, "That's my joy." And I also asked them about the Chilcotin connection because there's about 500 kilometers between there and the prison. So some of the impacts are truncated over that distance. And every single guy I talked to said, well, they need to learn how to grow their own food because they understood that it's not only about food security, but empowerment, autonomy, feeling good, working in the soil. As this other gentleman said, you can read books and stuff, but when it's hands-on, that's knowing. Being there and showing the people and helping them, letting them get their hands dirty and working alongside you. So that idea of partnership, of reciprocity was really, really powerful. So this layers into the wider Work to Give impacts. There's access to food within the context of the garden, helping hungry children within the context of going to bed hungry yourself, and then imagining a meaningful future based within your experience of the garden. The men talked about how they wanted to grow food when they got out and also how they wanted to give back. One of the guys said that he wasn't afraid of volunteering anymore and was hoping to be able to volunteer at some of the local food banks where he had maintained connections with people.
Okay, so that's a glimpse into the impacts on the men, but we wanted to focus significantly on the community, what we've learned from the community. So as Kelsey mentioned, we've been in 4 of the Chilcotin National Government communities, all that, did you say this, within up to about a 3-hour drive from Williams Lake. And so communities that are rural and remote, that have had their lives and basic needs undermined through colonialism and poverty, ongoing poverty, and lack of economic opportunity. And so the significance of the meeting basic needs is always understood within that context. So one of the first meetings we went to, we sat with a group of people from the community, from one community in particular, and there was a social development worker there. So I said, so we're here, we'd like to talk to you about how we can best learn from the communities about receiving the items. because we were doing a consultation around our methods. How can we best learn? What places do we need to show up in? You know, would going to asking to come into people's homes be appropriate? Could we be at community events? Should we be at where deliveries are happening? Like, how can we learn? And she looked at me and she said, you can't ask about how do people feel about these donated items. You can't start there. So we're like, oh, okay. And I just said, like, tell me why that is. And she said, because as soon as you say, how did it feel for you to get your kid to bed? The subtext of that is, I have a kid who hasn't been in bed, and now everybody knows. So this social development worker reminded us that people actually are often not going to pick up the stuff from the band office when the delivery comes because it exposes need in a way and creates a vulnerability. So there's all these people in the community that pick stuff up for community members. So the whole notion of asking people, what's it like when you go in and get out of bed, you know? I mean, we were well-intentioned, but that was really significant, and that the whole idea of meeting basic needs exposes and creates vulnerability. And had we have not listened to that, we could have done a lot of harm, right? So there were these micro kind of networks of getting stuff to people so that it didn't expose people. And the social development workers knew that better than anybody. So they are often the ones packing up their truck, driving into town. People don't actually always know where the stuff goes. And that's really, really important. So then we started having conversations with social development workers. And we actually did interview quite a lot of recipients, but in a very different way. And often they, in their interviews, wouldn't necessarily, we would talk about, you know, work to give. What do you think about work to give? What do you think about the items coming from the prison? We didn't kind of talk about what was it like for you to get your kid in the bed. But somewhere in the interview we heard, my kid finally has his own bed. And I think there's a story about one little girl who has her own bed, and it's the bed itself with the pride of this is my own space. But I think within like an hour, we've heard the story where she went and got a shoebox and put it right beside the bed and put her doll in there, like the doll had a bed, and then she had her bed. And this whole space was more than the furniture. It was pride and caretaking of this little doll. And so we really needed to start our analysis and even our interviewing from this idea of we're not here to solicit gratitude. We're not here to find about the recipients of care. This is just not what we're doing. And then we would do, I have to say, a lot of harm by doing that, particularly in the context of how research has done harm in communities and we, you know, how we represent what we find sometimes. So we have a really important theme to share, which is that in the very efforts of soliciting gratitude, we expose need. And that's central to our analysis. And so, I mean, this quote is just an example of a deeper understanding of just receiving things, that the community members really did understand that they were helping the guys inside and that this was their way of potentially apologizing. Maybe they want to apologize to the people for what they've done. So understanding being a recipient through that frame, not through just getting the stuff. So I kept explaining to them, they're there to help you guys. They just want to say we're sorry and stuff like that. So this is what they're starting to. This is the meaning of the recipient being a recipient in the project. So this idea of the list of items growing. So the list is sent to the men make many of the items. But how that list gets made is through an understanding that the list and the requests for items are also helping the men rather than meeting their own needs solely. So this is another layer of that very same theme, which is even when the sort of charity recipient discourse gets laid on, there's a lot of resistance in our data to being positioned as recipients only. And a real pushback where the impact on us is that we're helping our guys. And so that means they may not be from that community, but many of them are supporting the healing of a highly and grossly and inequitably overrepresented population in the prisons. So that idea of they're our guys and we're going to help them heal. So being recipients, that's the number one impact, helping them heal. I guess one of the things that the person says is to give back. Like sometimes our community members, what can we give back to them? What is acceptable? Can we bring those through those doors? What can we bring to them? What can they use? So a lot of our data was about the men. It wasn't about their own their own recipient status. It's something we'd like to do instead of all the giving. Realize that we can't make it past those doors. So this participant was saying, in order for Work to Give to be at its fullest potential, we'd actually like to go to the prisons and thank them ourselves. We want to invest to the degree that we would actually go. And so a very strong theme of wanting to reciprocate and the need for this whole project to have greater connection and reciprocity between communities and the men themselves. Another really key theme is that the community members understood it to be healing for the communities and healing for the men. And it's exactly the same thing the men said. It's healing for us, and we see it meets needs on the community side. So this idea of that needs and healing are interconnected on both sides. So we'll play that quote for you.
These types of programs are really important because we do have our own community members that are in prisons and jails all over. So it is our way of contributing and giving back to them and like making connection and then not really a direct type of way, but indirect, just to show that it means like a form of restorative justice in a way, where they can still be part of the community, maybe not in a direct way, but it's a rewarding, indirect way where they can contribute. I think it's a really good program. It helps the families and it helps the people that are incarcerated. So it benefits everybody on both sides. It helps with gives them closure, I'm thinking. Sorry.
Straight in here? Sure. So we have a couple more voice clips just because their voices are more powerful than ours.
The trust is slowly building up by the, inmates building these things and setting it up, then with the community accepting them, and receiving, it's not just our community, but the surrounding communities too. And I do see, with me, like with the bench that I have, it's pretty solid, it's pretty sturdy. Same with the shoe shelf that, they do put a lot of effort into the something that they make. We might have some issues with maybe a bit or two, but, other than that, a lot of them are pretty sturdy. And to me, I think this is the way of the inmates saying, I apologize for the things I've done out there. But, this is me, I can do this, I can help your community out. And basically, in a way, through the materials or making this time, this is what I'm thinking is, what I see is maybe, accept my apology, and stuff like that. This is, that's just my way of thinking. And then when the community accepts it, it's just like, they're, in a way, they're not saying it out loud, but when they accept these items, it's just like, yes, we accept your apology, or, thank you, and we don't.
Just before playing this quote, this is a Chilcotin man who lives in the community of Clayco, and he had been incarcerated in the past, and he's just standing in his garden, which had been disrupted multiple times by the federal government coming in and drilling welling. Is that the word, welling? Digging a well. So just the layering on of colonialism, even something so simple as just trying to grow food in his own backyard, kept on getting disrupted by these colonial government forces.
I don't blame them for where they're in.
Can you hear that?
I don't blame them for what happened to them. These were time.
So he was just saying that he doesn't blame them and he understands that life is complicated, that there's these other forces and structures impacting. So it was really easy for a lot of the Chilcotin people to see the humanity and potential of people in prison because they lived those experiences of structural violence and systemic racism. Sorry about the sound quality. Sure. So this is another Chilcotin individual who was showing me some smoked salmon that he had made, and he gifted it to me as a thank you, which was lovely. And just this idea, again, of having connections with people in prison. And even if they're not Chilcotin, there's this wider understanding of the impacts of colonialism, which are different but very similar across Indigenous groups across Canada. So people know people in prison, know people who have been in prison, and often have been in prison themselves. I have some of my extended family that have been in prison, and I've talked to them, and they said, well, if that program was in when I was in jail, I think it would make me feel, hey, I could still do something to help my people by doing this and giving me pride, make me feel that, hey, I'm human. So the understanding of work to give not only is something that's helping the men, but as a potential hope for their own family members who are incarcerated.
Oh, we didn't decide who was going to speak to this one. Just stare at each other for a while. Go ahead. Okay.
So the Chilcotin people had very strong values and ways of knowing and understanding healing and incarceration and rehabilitation, and this idea that there's all these systems that are disrupting that. So that Work to Give potentially provides an opportunity for Indigenous and non-Indigenous men, but particularly Indigenous men in prison, to connect with communities and get back some of that wealth of knowledge and that strength that comes from being part of a strong Indigenous community. And the Chilcotin really are a strong Indigenous community, and they have a lot to give. This program gives that sense of belonging to the men who are making these items. It gives them that sense of responsibility too. Normally a child grows up and they know that they have roles and responsibility, and that's the way they're supposed to go. But you might have trouble in the past where they broke the law. So it gives them a chance for growth. That's part of the medicine wheel that everyone needs to go through.
So one of the things we've learned is that the project in itself is underpowered because there's no explicit uptake of Chilcotin ways, Chilcotin values, Chilcotin knowledge. So this positioning as passive recipient, in effect, doesn't honor the deep connections that we're hearing in the data. So this is a good example of Chilcotin investment in not only keeping their people from prison, but how Chilcotin ways can benefit people. So you can prevent a lot of our First Nations people from being incarcerated or being the most highly represented people in the systems. To hope that we can change around using our culture, our laws, and our rituals. We had our own restorative justice. We had our own way of doing things. Though that was more powerful than the systems that are in place right now, because that doesn't offer much healing. So herein lies the potential for Work to Give. And so this is an image of Kelsey's, but this is a smokehouse, right? Mm-hmm. And so this idea that, and we've heard this from the communities, could the guys build smokehouses? Could the guys build things that foster cultural continuity in our communities? And so we've seen it around some items. So the men at Mission have been making drums. Those drums are going into communities. And in one community, or actually in Williams Lake, a youth drumming group has popped up. So a bunch of youth have drums that didn't have drums. And it's more than just getting the drum. They're coming together. And I think you even heard on a Friday night, like Friday night drumming group, right? A place to go, positive, drug and alcohol free. And the men have kickstarted that. And so the communities are talking about how do we leverage that, how do we foster that to its full potential. So this is one of the first guys that Colleen and I met. His name is Earl. He's being released now, and we hope he's going to be the star of our documentary. Because I came home and said to my kids when I said I was going, they're like, how was prison? I'm like, I met my new favorite people. Of course, they always say this stuff. What? I mean, yeah, just wait. He's going to be the star. We just have to find him. We're not sure where he is. But he talked in one day. Colleen and I said out there, we probably could have done the whole study in one day just on the basis of what we said, though I know it's hard to argue that you had one conversation and you have findings. But he talked about connecting with community, connecting with the men in the prison, and this as a chance to be a human being and exert rights, being able to breathe, being able to have food. So he already spoke to the connection between the two. there's so many, but we'll just move on because I'd like to hear you from that. So just finally, the communities, many of them, all of them, to a greater degree than talking about the items themselves, albeit those for importance said. And then this is their way of giving back to people. How we say that, a lot of people deserve a second chance, We all make mistakes. We're all human if you can learn from your mistakes. So we were told on that very first day that the Chilcotin way is to give people a second chance and to believe in them, and that they weren't giving up on them guys inside. And that was the whole trajectory then our analysis is taking. Okay, so we'll do this fairly briefly.
Yeah, this is a fancy new schematic that Helen and Colleen and I made, so we're very excited to show it to you. This is the overlapping context within which Work to Give exists. There's shifting colonial contexts upon which the communities exist and have their own context. There's the prison context within CSC, and then the men's personal contexts. Currently, Work to Give has the men experiencing belonging, giving back, and widening of the variable selves. They make, they give, and then the communities receive, and there's meaning within that. But a large part of the project is focused on charitable distribution, so it's a one-way giving. There's a little bit of feedback going back into the community through Punky Lake Wilderness Camp Society. They give Christmas cards and thank yous and do presentations. We'll show a couple of those later. And then the communities have these imagined impacts, these imagined connections with the men, but they're not facilitated by the program. So if it were to reach its full potential, healing on both sides, that idea of having connection and reciprocity between the communities and the men would take a strong foundation. Charitable distribution is still important, but would be kind of put to the back. Feedback would become two-sided, and reciprocity and investment would become a strong link between the two communities based in community strengths, priorities, and needs.
Kelsey made that, so she just rattles it off, right? I know. She showed it to me yesterday. I'm like, I know we did this, but it's just her brainchild.
So these are some of the handmade notes. There's a Christmas event every year, and the men make toys, and these are some of the drawings that the children then send back just as a thank you, and they are adorable.
So here's the potential, right? These one year, I think the kids all sent little bags to the men, a toothbrush, a new toothbrush, and something in there. One little kid asked, like, do they even get to have toothbrushes? So the idea was that community. Maybe somebody said no, who knows? And they all sent them. So this is the untapped potential. And so when we went out to mission and one of the institutions, some of these letters are up on the work board in there, right? And so, and the men, it's like a display of pride. Yeah, so this is the potential that we see. Kelsey, I'll just say a couple things about the garden.
Yeah, so the community. The work that I got to do in the garden is really an exciting way to look at these potentials. The people that received the food saw so much potential in the men and were really excited about giving back, giving lumber, gas, finding ways for the men to work with youth to have that ongoing connection and reciprocity. So I won't bother reading that quote just because we're running out of time. And yeah, the garden also really highlighted the importance of context and the importance of food and community strength. So this is a community member talking about how food's a big part of being Chilcotin and the strength of the salmon and the importance of advocating for the river. So finding ways for Work to Give and the garden to not only just give items, but to recognize that strength and that advocacy and resurgence and become an ally as opposed to just a distribution program.
So moving on from here, so we're happy to announce that we're moving forward with our very recent funding announcement. So, so this idea of trying to move the Work to Give model to both sustain it and scale it up on the community investment in the project. So working to learn more about what would it look like to shift from this charity model to one of greater reciprocity. How do we go beyond? So we've heard it's important, but what does that mean? How does it look? What does it look like? And how could the Work to Give intervention be scaled up to its full potential? And we know these two things from this project, that we need to resist the reinscribing of the passivity of being solely a recipient. So that's our starting point. But it's one thing to know that, but another thing to say, well, what would that look like? So that's our next step there. And then we need an ongoing better account of the context of need, because meeting needs is the primary purpose and it's important, but the charitable distribution model has a passive recipient. And there's a context of need here. There are basic needs that need to be met, and we need to have those factored into the model. And to capitalize on Chilcotin ways and community strengths. And so one of the commitments we had to Movember, if you can believe this, in our small study was that we would develop a model for work to give from the CSC side to sustain and scale it up so it would be integrated across the country. So I don't know, so we're going to have recommendations, but I don't know what we were thinking when we grandly pitched for 2 years with not a whole lot of money that we were going to do that. But we have significant recommendations from the community side about scale up and sustainability. So that's been the real gem, I think, of the community data. Community ownership and investment and tailoring to Chilcotin ways are really significant. So we're now funded, I was talking about next steps, but funded through private donors at the school to look at Indigenous approaches to wellness to improve a prison community partnership. So that's the next couple of years, to actually work closely with communities, using the methods we continue to have, build on the intervention. And we even imagine, you know, that the kind of work not unlike the other work I do in North Bay, where you do things and study them as you do them. So if elders in the community want to go to the prison and thank the men and sing and drum for them in the prisons, and that we could get that through the layers of CSC, then that'll be our research intervention, and we will study that, the impacts on the men. Look at the kind of model that would allow for that, because when we left one community, like they said, "Did you drive here? Like, we could just come now and thank the guys. Like, could we just come?" And so those are the kinds of things we're going to be doing. We're going to create spaces and places for reciprocity and connection, and then study them rather than theorize them or something. So mobilize our pilot findings to leverage that partnership potential. And then Kelsey's got an exciting thing specific to the garden. She's going to.
Part of my research, I was a cook in professional kitchens for about a decade prior to this phase of my life. And going up into the community I focused on, it was clear that vegetables were just being dropped off, and things like kohlrabi, many types of squash, garlic scapes, folks just didn't know what to do with them. So I partnered with a community dietitian and did a couple cooking workshops. And then we're submitting a grant to the Vancouver Foundation to continue to do that, but also to add in some hands-on interactive learning about food sovereignty, which will be guided by community priorities, but might include things like composting, internation trading, identifying viruses in wild salmon, and advocating for the closing of salmon farms that are spreading those and disrupting salmon runs. So hopefully you'll get that, and then continue to cook and learn with the Chilcotin and strengthen those reciprocities and relationships. So Sitchanelia, which is thank you in Chilcotin.
So thank you. This is a picture of the youth drumming group and their drums, so we thought we would leave it there. And here we go.